If you guys are in the market for a brand new computer, or if you can just keep striking out when it comes to picking out that latest graphics card, I think AMD's got you covered with their retail release of their latest APUs coming this August. However, I've seen a lot of videos here on YouTube talking about just how awesome these APUs are when it comes to graphical horsepower. Now, I've tested a lot of APUs here on the channel, and I'm just not quite convinced that they have the graphical horsepower to drive the latest AAA titles. So in today's video, we're going to be doing an APU review, focusing primarily on the graphical horsepower and seeing what kind of performance we should expect when doing casual gaming, esports, as well as AAA titles. Hey guys, Turk here. Hope you're having a great day. Man, I really am kind of glad that we've waited as long as we've had to do this 5700G review. Just this past week, Lisa Su and AMD announced that they're going to be doing their full retail release of their 5600G and 5700G. And of course, as a cherry on top, they announced that FSR, or Fidelity Super Resolution, it's going to work on all of the AMD APUs up to this point. With all that said though, guys, I am really curious to see how AMD's Ryzen APUs have fared, going all the way from their 2400G all the way up to their latest release. So let's start off by looking at the spec sheet. Now again, this is not AMD's first rodeo when it comes to APUs and integrated graphics. This is actually their 4th generation when it comes to their Ryzen APUs. Now on the left we have the 2400G, which only has 4 cores and 8 threads teamed up with 4 megabytes of L3 cache. Now back in the old days of the Zen architectures, we only had boost clock speeds of 3.9 gigahertz with a base clock of 3.6 gigahertz. Now with the incremental increases with the 3400G and the 4700G, we go from Zen Plus to Zen 2, and now we have the 5700G, which is the top dog with the Zen 3 cores, and it's going to have double the amount of cores at 8 and 16 threads, but we've actually quadrupled the amount of L3 cache on this particular design. Now what's most impressive here, guys, is we are getting a boost clock speed of 4.6 gigahertz, and man, look at that, the base clock, it's almost actually the exact boost clock of our 2400G. Now shifting gears over to the iGPU, the 2400G actually has the Vega 11 architecture equipped with 11 compute units. With that, it's going to have 704 shaders, but the downside with this APU is going to be the 1250 megahertz for the boost clock. Now going over to the 5700G, we actually have 3 fewer compute units with the Vega 8 design, but we do still have 512 shaders, but we do get an impressive boost clock speed of 2000 megahertz. Now what's interesting here is if we go back a generation to the 4700G, which again wasn't publicly available as a retail processor, they have the same compute units, but they do have 100 extra megahertz on top. So I would expect that the graphics performance of the 4700G would be better, but with the 5700G, again, we do get those Zen 3 cores, and there's probably some IPC improvements baked into the design as well. Fortunately for us though, all of these APUs are rated for 65 watts, so if you're doing an upgrade, it should just be a drop-in replacement. Of course, make sure your motherboard supports it and it has a BIOS that can support the AGESA 12.0.2. And as I mentioned earlier, the biggest improvements here are going to be with the Zen 3 cores, and I don't want to spoil too much for next week's video, so make sure you hit the bell icon. That way you can learn a little bit more of what this particular CPU has to offer. Now the biggest downside when it comes to this particular APU is the price. If we compare it to the 2400G, the 5700G comes in shockingly at $360, which is practically twice the cost of the older APUs. Now, we are getting double the amount of cores from the previous generation, and we're getting those Zen 3 cores like we've mentioned earlier, and we're getting a little bit better of a graphics solution, so it is a pretty reasonable price. But if you look at the big scheme of things when it comes to AMD's CPU lineup, this is actually a pretty decent option for an 8-core offering from AMD. Now let's compare the 5700G against its direct competitors from Intel, the Rocket Lake-based CPUs with the Intel ZLP-based iGPU solutions. Now, it shouldn't come as a shock to anybody, but nobody really recommends gaming on Intel's integrated graphics because they got significantly slower graphics clock speeds, significantly lower shader counts, and those two factors alone, that is just going to be not enough horsepower to play even the most casual games at these decent resolutions. The only silver lining that I can think of from Intel's integrated graphics is having access to that quick sync hardware encoder, which, let's be honest guys, AMD's hardware encoders on their GPUs as well as their APUs, it's not all that great. So fortunately though, for the 5700G, those additional cores, you can use that for x264 encoding. But again guys, AMD's solutions for integrated graphics are just far superior than anything that Intel could throw at them. With the specs out of the way, this isn't exactly a CPU review and it's not exactly a GPU review, so I can't just throw it into any of my existing test benches. I wanted to originally throw this into my PlayStation 2 build, but unfortunately the ASRock Desk Mini A300 just doesn't support this particular processor. Now, there is the X300 Desk Mini, but it still doesn't have support either. So I went to you guys over in the community tab wondering how much memory y'all throw at your particular APU builds, and y'all recommended 16 gigs. So I'm gonna be throwing the 5700G into my B550 Unify X. It's got 2 different DIMM slots in it, and I'm gonna be putting in 16 gigabytes of DDR4 3200 in there, similar to what I've tested in my CPU test bench. And since this is kind of like the last hurrah when it comes to Vega-based APUs, I figured why not see how far we can push this sucker, and we're going to be overclocking this with Precision Boost Overdrive for the Zen 3 cores. We're going to bump up the graphic clock speed up to 2300 megahertz, and we're also going to run the memory in 1-to-1 mode with the F clock and the memory clock being synced, and we're going to run at DDR4 3800. Now, I have seen some videos here on YouTube of people running the 5700G at DDR4 4000, but they're not running in that sync mode because honestly, 1-to-1 synced with 4000, it's just not very stable on many motherboards. So if you see any discrepancies in my frame rates compared to some of the other builds, that's probably one of the key factors. With all the hardware out of the way, let's talk about the games. Again, this isn't a standard review, so I will be doing many of the games we do in our GPU reviews, but I'm also going to be throwing in several esports titles like Valorant, Overwatch, Rainbow Six Siege, but I'm also going to throw in Final Fantasy XIV because I did renew my subscription, getting ready for the Endwalkers expansion coming later this year. So we've got a pretty good lineup of games. So with all that said, let's jump into the charts. Let's do some good news and bad news for our 5700G. Starting off with the good news, esports is a great opportunity for our APUs today. Going with Valorant at 1080p, our 5700G is able to get over 144 Hz at the high detail settings, which is quite remarkable given that we're not running a dedicated graphics card. However, the 2400G, it's not that far off with nearly 100 FPS at 1080p, so it's a pretty good experience for a APU graphics solution. Going to Rainbow Six Siege, the 5700G at 1080p is able to get over 60 FPS, but again, the 2400G is able to hit that same threshold with a little room to spare. And going over to Overwatch, the 5700G and 2400G are right above 60 FPS at 1080p, which just goes to show that esports is a great opportunity for this APU. Now for the meh news. At 1080p with Apex Legends with the high detail settings, we can almost hit 1080p 30 FPS, which isn't enjoyable, but it is at least looking good. But unfortunately though, at 720p, we don't manage to hit 60 FPS. Going over to Call of Duty, it's a similar story with similar results, and it's just very frustrating that both of these pretty popular games are not playable with this particular solution. You can, of course, tweak the settings a little bit, maybe use some of the dynamic resolution scaling with Call of Duty, but again, it's frustrating that we can't play these games on the APU. Now, what about an MMO? For Final Fantasy XIV, we are able to hit 30 FPS with our overclocked 5700G, so if we tune our settings a little bit, maybe go with the desktop low settings, we can get 30 FPS there and probably get to 60 FPS with 720p. Now, a bit of good news here is GTA 5 is able to hit 60 FPS at 720p with our overclocked 5700G, and we're able to get over 30 FPS at 1080p with just our stock settings. Now, I would call this an absolute win for the 5700G over the 2400G, which shows that this little APU with our Zen 3 cores is able to play games at a decent rate. And now for the bad news. Unfortunately, Doom Eternal is unable to hit 60 FPS at 720p with our 5700G. and at 1080p we only managed to scrape by with 30 FPS. So if you're looking for additional performance in this particular title, you're either going to need to adjust your settings down or do your overclock and hope for the best. Going into F1 2020, we usually see pretty dang good performance out of this game, but unfortunately with our APUs at 1080p we only managed to get 30 FPS, and at 720p we don't get anywhere close to 60 FPS. Going into Gears 5, a similar story is shown, where we unfortunately don't even hit 30 FPS at 1080p, and we are sub 60 FPS at 720p. Hitman 3 has very similar results to Gears 5, where neither resolution hits either of the targets, 1080p at 30 FPS or 720p at 60 FPS. Shadow of the Tomb Raider also has pretty decent scaling, but again, doesn't show any good performance when it comes to our settings, though we are able to hit 720p at 30 FPS at both our 5700G and our overclocked settings. So I would call that definitely a win for the 5700G. Assassin's Creed Valhalla is a pretty demanding title, and unfortunately at 720p it just doesn't look all that great when all things are considered. And unfortunately 720p at 30 FPS, it's just not a really good time. And unfortunately Horizon Zero Dawn, Metro Exodus, Crysis, and Cyberpunk, they are all below 30 FPS at 720p, and if you're going to try and do 1080p, good luck guys. So as we start to look over some of these multiple game averages, I wanted to actually show some footage of some of these games that hit the 720p 60 FPS breakpoint and compare it against the 1080p at 30 FPS breakpoint, because I've seen a lot of comments in my FSR videos showing that people are more willing to take the lower resolution when compared to the higher frame rates, and I was wondering what you guys thought about these particular videos. So as we scroll through these charts, let me know down in the comments on which resolution and frame rate looks best to you. Now the next chart we have is all the different games put up against one another with the 30 FPS threshold marked in red. Now for the 2400G at 720p, we're able to get above 30 FPS in all titles except for Crysis, Horizon Zero Dawn, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, Cyberpunk, and Metro Exodus. And unfortunately, when we upgrade our processor to the 5700G, we don't actually gain any additional games that have increased frame rates to break past that threshold, which is quite unfortunate given the improved Zen cores and the slight bump in graphical horsepower. But at 1080p, that's where we start to see the advantages of the upgraded processor, with only 3 of the different games able to get above 30 FPS at 1080p. With the 5700G, we're able to get above 30 FPS in F1 2020, GTA 5, and Doom Eternal. And the last instance here is if we take the geo-mean average of all the games at all the different resolutions, we unfortunately don't get above 30 FPS on average with our 5700G at 1080p, and we're only able to get 46 FPS on average at 720p with our 5700G. So before we wrap this video up, I wanted to talk a bit about the mindset of what it means to use an APU when it comes to gaming. Now, the first question I'm always asked is, do I think that an APU is worthwhile as a GPU solution for gaming? Now, if you guys really like high resolutions, high frame rates, or high detail settings, APUs are just definitely not going to cut it, and I definitely recommend you guys stick it out just a little bit longer in order to pick up a dedicated graphics card, even if it's just a GTX 1050 Ti. As you saw in the charts, many of the modern games and AAA games, we just can't even get 30 FPS at 1080p, which is quite honestly substandard for a typical gaming experience. However, if you're willing to sacrifice on your resolution, on your detail settings, or run your games at lower frame rates, I think an APU could be a pretty decent option. When it comes to esports, we were getting above 100 FPS in most instances, and there were several different casual-ish games that you could play at 1080p, 30 FPS, or bump at 720p at 60 FPS. However, though, if you are going to want to bump it up and play some of the more latest games, you're just going to have to get that dedicated graphics card. And that just brings up the next question. For how long will an APU-based graphics solution be viable? Again, for esports, I think you've got several more years left in it because, Valorant is only a year old and we're already getting above 100 FPS at 1080p. And as long as the barrier to entry for those esports titles is relatively low, I think our APUs are going to be able to handle it just fine. And when it comes to casual gaming, most of these games can be played at 30 FPS or slightly reduced resolution or detail settings, and that might be suitable for quite some time going forward. However, guys, let's not forget that AMD did announce that FSR, or their Fidelity Super Resolution, is going to work on their APUs, and that might be just enough to get us past a couple different breakpoints. However, if we go back to that 1080p chart, I just don't think a lot of the modern games or AAA games are going to be able to realize the advertised improvements that we have seen from their marketing team. Going from 20 FPS up to 40 FPS, that might not be enough for most gamers. So the promises of increased frame rates from lowering our detail settings, I don't know if that's going to be as applicable to APUs as we're all hoping it to be. However, though, this will require quite a bit more testing on my part, so make sure you guys hit the subscribe button down below, because I'm definitely interested in seeing just how far we can push these little bitty APUs. Alright, so we've gotten a lot of data under our belt, so now it's time to talk brass tacks. Would I recommend the 5700G as my graphical solution? Now, before I talk specifically about the 5700G, let's talk about APUs in general for a second. Now, if I'm going to be doing esports or casual gaming, I would definitely say that an APU is a solid recommendation, especially since you don't have to dedicate money towards getting that graphics card. We can run our games at lower detail settings and lower resolutions, and that might just get us enabled to have a good time and enjoy our gaming experience. Now, is the 5700G worth it as a graphics solution? Well, if we're sticking to casual gaming and esports, one could argue that the 2400G, it's actually quite comparable when it comes to the raw performance, and the 5700G might not be worth it. However, though, as we said at the beginning of the video, we do get access to all of those Zen 3 cores, we get access to all the Zen 3 frequencies, increased data rates thanks to the newer chipsets, and guys, I think the overall ecosystem that we're able to build off of this processor is going to be far superior to our older 2400G based systems. So then it begs the question, should you get the 5700G or the 5600G? If you're willing to sacrifice 2 additional cores, I think the 5600G might be the better option, especially since the graphics portion can overclock to about the similar levels as our 5700G. However, if you go with the 5700G and you pick it up in a pre-built system, I think that is a great upgrade value option, where if you got the right power supply, the right case, and you can find that magic graphics card, going with that particular solution is going to give you a much better gaming experience when compared to the 5600G. And if we compare the 5700G to the 5800X, that's where things get really exciting, because next week we're going to be looking at all of this from the CPU perspective. We're going to look at it from the 5800X, the 5900X, and the 10700K. And guys, the 5700G, I think it is a pretty overall well-rounded processor for anyone looking to build a system. So guys, I appreciate you watching the video. I hope y'all have a great day. We'll catch you guys in the next one, Turk Force. Later.